Buonasera a tutti.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to those of you who are here with us and those of us who follow online. Welcome. It is a great pleasure and it is an honor for us to have Professor NORDHAUS with us. Professor NORDHAUS is going to voice a proposal of his to accelerate the mitigation process of emissions by means of an agreement amongst countries. Professor NORDHAUS was born in Albuquerque, in New Mexico, in the US. He attended Yale University, and he's also attended university in France and at the MIT. He then became a professor at the Yale University, where he still holds a chair today. Professor NORDHAUS has been awarded several prizes. For example, he sits at the National Academy of Sciences. He's been the president of the Association of Economists in the US. But I believe that he's most important as a chairperson for committees at the National Academy, for example, on very interdisciplinary subjects as nuclear power, alternative energy, and at the very time when this problem cropped up in the 70s, he drafted a report on global warming and on the potential policies to counter that. So this interdisciplinary nature comes through its all papers and books. Indeed, he has been working on salaries, on economic growth, and he also has published papers on exotic subjects, as it were. As, for example, he has drafted works on the light of the earth to try and explain the granular level of GDP, not just at national level, but at a much more local level. Then he has drafted papers on health, on the cost of the war in Iraq, on the way artificial intelligence may impact economic growth. But one of the subjects that perhaps has been closest to his heart is that of the connection between climate change and economic growth. He's been awarded a Nobel Prize for Economy together with Brummel in 2018, and he developed models. And I'm talking about such models because I believe this is a central subject, because the language of mathematics that he developed enable or pave the way to the interdisciplinary approach that perhaps has been unparalleled. He actually crafted a new discipline. And he made such models available on the web, open source, so that anybody worldwide can work on such models, further develop it or question it, or he's been a forerunner of the concept of open science, something on which Europe is pushing forward. Having said as much, I'd like to give him the floor. He is going to have some 35 minutes contribution, then take some questions. If you want to ask questions, you can do so also on the online channel, and then I'm going to address him the questions that you have. Having said as much, and without any further ado, I'd like to give him the floor. So over to you, Professor NORDHAUS.
Thank you very much, Professor Bosetti. It's wonderful to see you, Valentina. And it's a great honor to address this audience. I'm sorry that I suppose along with many other people, I'm sorry that I am in my house rather than joining you in Italy. So what I would like to do is talk today about national and international policies to slow climate change. This, of course, will be well understood in Europe, in the EU, which has been really a forerunner, a pioneer in developing policies at the national level and at the multinational level. Other countries are further behind, and the country in which I am is so far behind as to be invisible. But we're not going to talk about politics today. We're going to talk about economics and the economics about slowing global warming. So I have some slides I'd like to share with you today, and they're really not complicated slides. They're more to orient you as we go along. So again, international and national policies on global warming. So these are the 4 issues I'd like to talk to you about today. The first one is a combination of science and economics. It's that there's been very little progress in slowing emissions, and I'll start with that. Then I want to say a word about the particular challenges of the incentives for low carbon technologies. That will be a key problem going forward. Third, I will mention the important role of carbon pricing. This is well known among economists and environmentalists, but not so widely known among the population, and perhaps not that widely accepted among the public. And then finally, I'd like to talk about the need for a climate compact to combat international free riding. Is the audio okay, Val? Can I get it?
Yes. It's perfect.
Okay. I just want to make sure that I'm not talking to myself.
No, you're not. We're all here for you.
Thank you. All right. Let's start with global CO2 emissions. These are the best data we can come up with. These are data going back for over a century. The blue line is the global emissions of CO2. These include, as best we can, not just energy and cement CO2, but other industrial CO2, but not land emissions. Those are in billions of tons per year. And the red line there, straight line on logarithmic paper, is a rate of growth, averaging 2.6% per year over this period. And at the top, I put a green circle up here. Let's see if I can. This green circle, just to focus your eyes on that. What you can see is that through the latest data, which we have, which is 2019, preliminary data, but the latest data, there's very little slowdown in the growth. It depends on how far back you look, but basically it's growing at, in the last few years, at roughly 2% a year. Of course, if we're going to meet our targets, that has to not just stop growing rapidly, but has to decline. But the main point of this is that it's been growing rapidly. CO2 emissions have been growing rapidly. And even with all the treaties and accords, Kyoto, Copenhagen, and Paris, we've not seen a slowdown. I thought it might be interesting to ask what's happened during the pandemic. So this shows you the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And these are actually weekly data going back to 1957. And you can see, I don't have it in here, but you can see at the very end here that there has not been a slowdown, even though there has been some slowdown in economic activity. We're in the midst of a global recession. You can't actually see that in the CO2 concentrations. So this is also an interesting suggestion that it will take more than just slower economic growth to slow climate change. Okay. So let's move on now. I just wanted to give you a little taste of the science here, and let's move on to the role of economics in climate policy. So there are 3 insights that I'd like to bring to you from economics. The first is about technological change and innovation. The second is about carbon pricing. And the third is about international agreements. So let's start with low carbon technologies. The key point that really we need to begin with is that of course, new technologies require inventions, innovations, research, development, commercialization, and what we know from economic studies for half a century is that there are very big spillovers. Just as there are in pollution, there are very big spillovers in the returns to innovation. The inventors, the innovators, capture relatively little of the social value of their inventions. So if we look at the second bullet there, the public returns on innovation, we know that they're many times larger than private returns. We don't know 2, 3, 4, 10 times the rate of return on private rate of return on innovation. Of course, there's a larger gap at the more fundamental end than at the more applied end. But the key point is that we know that because of this, there's underinvestment in innovation. Now, even worse, there's even a worse story, even a more terrible story about low carbon innovations. There's actually a double externality here. There are two externalities at work. There's the innovation externality, that if you invent a low carbon technology, an inventor only gets part of the return, but also there's the climate impacts externality, that even if you do capture some of the return, because the emissions are underpriced, you'll lose a little more, or depending where you are, a lot more of the returns to low carbon technologies. So we have to understand that this is a huge impediment to moving forward over the long run. Over the long run, where we know that much of our infrastructure in all of our countries will need to be replaced over the next 50 years if we move to a zero carbon economy. Policy will require fixing this climate externality. It requires special incentives for low carbon innovation, and it means also, to fix the double externality requires two things. It requires fixing the climate externality, which will be on the next slide, and it also requires special incentives for low carbon technologies. But on that one, I'm going to pass, leave that for another day or maybe for some questions, and move to the carbon pricing. So that was key economic insight number one. I should say also that Paul Romer, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018, won the Nobel Prize for the first two bullets here, for understanding the nature of information, for understanding the nature of innovation and invention, and for showing how that affected economic growth. All right. So let's move to economic insight number two, which is about carbon prices. If we think of the kinds of policies that are needed, not just for the long run, but for the near term, with existing technologies, existing stock of capital, or existing designs of capital, not talking about fundamental new inventions and innovations, but what we have to work with today, then the high price on CO2 emissions is the key to sharp emissions reductions. And it has many features. I'll mention some of the reasons, the ways in which high CO2 prices work. First, the key thing to understand is that reducing emissions requires actions by virtually everybody. It requires action of billions of people around the world. It requires actions of millions of companies. It requires the actions of hundreds, thousands of local governments, and it requires the actions of hundreds of national governments. So you need some way to coordinate the actions of all these different players, from the billions of individuals like you and me to the hundreds of governments like the US or Italy or Japan. And the key way to do that, and this is the insight of economics, is to have a high price on CO2 emissions, so that when people make their decisions as to how to transport themselves, what kind of capital to buy, whether to replace a refrigerator or a furnace, whether to insulate their house, whether to walk or to drive, whether to take the train or to fly, all these kinds of decisions, everyday decisions, they can be affected by the price of CO2. A second feature of a high price of CO2 is the decisions of producers. Producers probably are the more important side of this, at least in the short run. Producers make the decision of how to produce things as well as what to produce. And the most important is how to produce them. If you take electricity generation, the US produces with virtually every technology, but some of them are high carbon technologies like coal. So a high price on CO2 makes coal generation much less profitable. It makes natural gas more profitable, and it makes renewables even more profitable. So this high price will affect the decisions of producers, particularly in industries that are carbon intensive. I've already mentioned the third way that high carbon prices affect our economy, and that is through innovation. And this surprises many people. And it goes back to my last point about the need for stimulating this slide about low carbon technologies. It's a puzzle to many people. Why are prices important for innovation? And the reason is, for profit-making companies who do a lot of the R&D in energy, do a lot of the R&D in energy capital, they look at the future prices when they decide upon their decisions. So if companies are in a low carbon price environment and think it will continue to be a low carbon price environment, then they have very little incentive to invest in low carbon technologies. On the other hand, if they're in a high carbon price environment, and particularly one where they see not only high but rapidly rising carbon prices, then they will have an incentive to turn to low carbon technologies for their research and development. And there's one simple example that makes this point. If you think of carbon capture and sequestration, which is a technology, just think of it as taking the carbon out of the stack gas, turning it into a liquid, pumping it somewhere, putting it somewhere where it lasts for a long time. This technology will cost, according to different estimates, $100 a ton of CO2, some as high as $300 of CO2. But no company will be interested in doing this if the price of CO2 is zero. When the price of CO2 rises sharply, then production of CO2, which is what this technology is, will become profitable, and companies will think about it. But at that point, they will also begin to do research and development on these technologies. So technologies like CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, and similar ones, which don't make any sense in a zero carbon environment, will make sense in a high carbon environment. A fourth reason is that actually carbon pricing simplifies our lives as individuals, as ethical individuals. Many of us worry about our carbon footprint, And the reason we worry about our carbon footprint is because carbon is mispriced. If carbon were appropriately priced, we wouldn't need to worry about our carbon footprint because the social costs of our activities would be embodied in the goods and services that we consume. So those are the reasons that economists have developed for looking at carbon prices and thinking that they're a key to changing our system, our energy system. So what else have economists pointed to? They pointed to the fact that the level of price should be harmonized, and it should be set to meet your climate target. So let's take the second of these two. Let's assume you want to reach a 2 degrees C temperature target. Then what you need to do is working backwards with your technologies, your economic growth, the different industries, the different countries. You need to work back to what are the emissions that are consistent with that target. And then you need to work backwards from that to the carbon price that is consistent with the emissions that are consistent with your temperature target. So one of the problem that's a conceptually pretty straightforward, although empirically rather complicated. It's interesting that when Valentina mentioned the integrated assessment models that economists have developed, that's actually one of the most important things they can do, is they can ask what level of carbon price will induce what level of emissions, which will lead to what level of global temperature, or working backwards from temperature, or another target to emissions and to carbon prices. So that's one important feature of carbon prices. A second one is that they should be harmonized. By harmonized, I mean they should be equalized across different uses of carbon, of emissions of carbon dioxide. That would be among firms in the same industry. They should be equal. Among industries in the same country, they should be equal. And among countries, they should be equal. So, for example, if we take the case of Europe, to a first approximation, CO2 prices are equalized in the sectors that are covered by the European scheme, emission scheme or plan, but not outside it. So they're harmonized within, but not outside it. And they're not harmonized outside it really at all. Finally, they should be harmonized across countries to minimize the cost of meeting our climate targets. Final point, what are prices? What should they be? And how are we meeting our target? Well, if you take the second bullet and ask what is a normative carbon price that you would meet, say for a cost-benefit analysis or for a 2-degree target or a 3-degree target. I won't ask about a 1.5 degree target because most models can't reach it, but they would be somewhere in the range of $40 or $50 a ton at one end, up to as much as $200 a ton at the other end. So the numbers started around $40 or $50 for the most modest objectives and go up from there. Again, so let's say $50 a ton of CO2, harmonized, all sectors, all companies, all nations. So the question is, how are we doing? Not well. So this slide shows you the carbon price landscape for 2019. These numbers are from the World Bank. And what I've done is rank them from top to bottom by the effective carbon price. The effective carbon price is the percentage of the region covered, the carbon price, and then the product of those two. And the last column shows the fraction of global emissions that are covered. And Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, BC, France, California, the ETS, and so on down, And the last line is 80% of the globe is uncovered. And then the bottom, where the little circle is, shows the effective carbon price averaged across the countries is around $2 a ton. So there are 2 points here that I'd like you to take away. One is, obviously, the prices are not harmonized. They're not harmonized across the countries. There are a few that are modestly high, and there are the vast majority which are zero. And also they're very low. They're nowhere near the lowest of the estimates that are produced by the models. And they're surely nowhere near what would be needed to achieve our 2-degree target. So this brings me to the last insight of economics, which is the third key insight is the global free rider problem. Now, I suspect the first 2 of these are well known to many of you and reasonably well known to most of you. But the global free rider problem is one you might know in the sense you have observed it, but not have thought about a lot as you think about carbon policy. So the basic point I'd like to make here is that after 30 years of working on climate policy, we're at a dead end. If we start with COP1, COP2, COP3, COP4, COP5, COP6, and go on through whatever the latest is, COP20 something, they all have been motivated by a simple model and flawed model of international agreements, flawed for this kind of problem. And the reason is they have been the conceptual underpinnings of the Kyoto Protocol, the Copenhagen Accord, Paris Accord, is as voluntary international agreements, not mandatory ones, not ones that I'll turn to in a minute. The result of that is that we see the free rider problem. And I'll just say what I mean by the free rider problem. You all probably know what it is. But the example I usually use when I think of free riders or talk to people, I think of a European trolley system where you get on and you don't have a ticket, you don't have a pass, and you say, should I or should I not buy a pass? It's pretty expensive, so maybe I'll just ride free, and because nobody ever gets caught. Well, I don't know if it's true, nobody ever gets caught, but if you think that nobody ever gets caught, I'm going to ride free, then you've succumbed to the free rider problem. Now, if we turn to why this is a free rider for climate change treaties and agreements, international ones, I should say, there are 2 reasons. Well, the main one is that they are voluntary. They are not mandatory for countries to join. Secondly, even for countries that join, there are no penalties for non-participation or for non-adherence. Countries that didn't participate in the binding limits of the Kyoto Protocol, which were most countries of the world, were not penalized. And then countries which didn't meet their targets under the Kyoto Protocol weren't penalized. So these are, in some deep sense, voluntary agreements. Teddy Roosevelt once said about American foreign policy, speak softly and carry a big stick. Well, for climate agreements, it's countries talk loud and carry no stick at all. Now, why do I say this? What's the evidence for this? Well, one piece of evidence is just the underlying economics of this, but I'll pass on that. But the other one is that both on the prices and the quantities, we see in the last slide that the average level of carbon prices in the world is very low. And this kind of carbon price is never going to get you to a 2-degree target. And then the other is, if we go back to this slide, you also see that there's been very little change in the rate of growth of CO2 emissions. And that's another piece of evidence that if you had an effective climate policy, that this curve would be turning down, would have turned down up before now. So the verdict is, we have international agreements. They're voluntary. They have no penalties for non-performance. They are therefore subject to free riding. And if we actually look at both the prices and the emissions, we see there has been free riding. This is not just theory, this is reality. So final slide, what can we possibly do about that? So one idea is to redesign international agreements, and I call it a climate club or a climate compact, to overcome free riding. And the basic point about this is to think of a different model for such an agreement. And I like to think of it as the club structure. What is a club? A club is something, we're all in different kinds of clubs or compacts, but a club is easiest to think of. When you're in a club, you have certain privileges and you have certain obligations. Your obligations are usually to pay the dues, and the privileges are whatever the club does. It might be a gym club, it might be a running club, it might be a swim club, it might be a ski club, whatever. Many organizations we are in have the same structure. If you work at a university, you have the privilege of working at the university, but you have an obligation. If you're a student, you have the privilege of learning at a university, but you also have to follow the rules, not to mention the tuition, at least in some places. So we need to move from a structure where there are all privileges and no obligations to one where there are privileges and obligations. So the climate compact that I will mention involves two features. The first feature is what you call the obligation, the costly obligation. And this would be an obligation to have a certain carbon price domestically, perhaps $50 per ton of CO2. Doesn't say how you meet that. It could be through a cap and trade, as in Europe. It could be through a carbon tax, as in British Columbia. But that part of the requirements of being in the compact is that you meet your agreed upon obligation. The obligation is part of the agreement that underlies a compact, so the people agree to it when they join it. And the second part is a penalty tariff on non-participants, so that if you are either a non-participant or you violate the agreement, then you are met with a penalty tariff by the members of the compact or club. I would add, for those of you who have thought about this, and many of you have, that the one difference, I don't know if it's a slight difference, but difference of this proposal from a standard is that this proposal assumes a uniform tariff on all imports rather than a tariff on the carbon content of imports. It's for technical economic reasons, the uniform tariff is a better one. There's been some modeling at Yale where we did this. I've done it and others have done it. And the modeling using another kind of modeling of the kind that Valentina discussed, but uses coalition modeling, suggests that this kind of two things. One is, if you use these coalition models, you'll see that a Kyoto or Paris type agreement rapidly degenerates into a non-cooperative low abatement agreement, but it also suggests that a climate compact of the kind I'm discussing here, with a carbon price and a penalty on non-participants, can actually induce high abatement and combat free riding. Okay, so let me summarize. So I think the first insight of economics in this is that low carbon technologies are plagued by this double externality, the externality of the innovation spillover and the externality of climate emission of CO2 and other emissions themselves. A key part of our policy, if we're going to combat this, is to have high and harmonized carbon prices. And I stress both of those, high and harmonized. If we look around the world, we have low and unharmonized prices today. And then third point is that we can have strong incentive compatible international agreements with a climate compact. And the climate compact is a compact of countries where you have mandatory carbon price policies plus tariff penalties for non-participants. Well, thank you for bearing with me. I'm glad to be with you. And again, I'm sorry I'm 3,000 miles away rather than in a hall to join you. And that's it for this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, for being with us. As usual, devo parlare in inglese, quindi...
I apologize, I forgot I should be speaking Italian. Whenever you speak, there's something that drives me nuts, that you never use any wrong word. You speak slowly, but you always say the perfect word. It is such a pleasure to follow your meeting. I'm going to read out a few questions. They've been written in English, but because of the function of the meeting, I'm going to read them out in Italian. The first has to do with the chart that you showed on the CO2 concentrations. You showed us this chart because that includes the most recent data you had. And it shows, that chart shows that CO2 is on the increase. Roberto Barbiero is asking you, but as a matter of fact, emissions, which is something different from concentrations, have dropped with coronavirus. The rate of this decline hasn't been accounted for as yet, but the real problem has to do with the resumption of business as usual, with emissions growing even stronger to recover from COVID, and this is something that has to be avoided. What do you think about it?
I think many of us know that CO2 emissions have fallen since March, so maybe since February. We don't have very good measures of global CO2 emissions. They lag at least a year behind reality. We suspect that they're down maybe 10 or 20%, but we don't actually have the data. But what I was interested in was what's the impact on what actually matters for climate change, which is concentrations. And I thought when I first looked at this, I looked at this about a month ago, that you would be able to see some slight decline. Let me just go back to that slide so we know what we're looking at here. I thought we would be able to see a slight decline in emissions. So this has a seasonal cycle, which you might take out, but I didn't take out. But I thought, well, maybe instead of just going up like this, it would go maybe like this. So maybe decline a little bit. And I was actually very struck by the fact that you actually, even all the statistical analyses I did of this, I couldn't find any sign at all of a decline in CO2 concentrations. And this, by the way, is through September 15th. You can have weekly data. So this is not like last year or last month. This is like 2 weeks ago. Data as of 2 weeks ago, weekly data. I mean, it's incredible. One thing I'd say, what incredible data. I mean, the people who I just would bow down to the people, I know who they are, but I won't mention them. They're not the people who had the idea of collecting these data. And of course, Valentina talked about open science, making these data available to people. What a wonderful public service. So what do I take of, so coming back to this graph, what do I take of it? Really two things. One is that there's tremendous inertia. The key thing is there's tremendous inertia in the Earth system. Even though we're in the middle of probably the worst global recession since the Depression, maybe not the worst, but maybe the financial crisis was worse, but I don't know, but pretty close. You cannot see it in these data because there's so much inertia. And the inertia comes from the carbon cycle, cycling through the oceans and the biosphere. So we can't count on this just reminds us we can't count on short-term measures to reduce this key driver of climate change. And then the other thing, that was really the most important thing I took from this. But the other thing I took from this was people say, well, all you have to do is slow the economy. Well, maybe so, but we've had a pretty dramatic slowdown of the economy. And here again, we don't see any change. So again, I thought this was just a reminder of the tremendous inertia. And of course, this is just one part of the inertia because there's a further inertia in the sense that the climate change itself lags behind the concentrations. And then there's another lag by decades. And then there's another lag as some of the global impacts, such as the melting of the giant ice sheets, lag further behind temperature. So it's just a reminder of the tremendous inertia of the system. It's not like the pandemic where it just doubles every 3 or 4 days. This is something where it's a very long-term problem and we have to deal with it now knowing it. And this is just a wonderful example of how much inertia there is in the system.
Grazie mille. Ti faccio la seconda domanda che viene da Alessandro Sardone.
Thank you very much. A second question from Sardone, who's asking about, with your model, does industrial emissions influence climate change based on carbon? But in the present situation, and referring to the post-COVID crisis, where both the GDP and emissions on a yearly basis will be reduced importantly, what do you think is going to be the result of your model? Do you think there's going to be such a rapid recovery with GDP and emissions so that the actual drop is going to be offset or compensated?
One of the things I've learned in my many mistakes as an economist is not to forecast something that's so intrinsically difficult as the recovery from this. We've heard a lot in climate economics about fat tails, and many of you will know the work of Martin Weitzman, recently died of Harvard University, who pointed to the possibility of fat tails in impacts of climate change on human societies. And there was a big argument about whether they are fat tails or they're not fat tails, but in any case, it alerts us to the present. Well, this is a very fat-tailed event. We have never in our modern economy seen anything like this. And so I'm very hesitant to make any, I'm not only hesitant, I'm not going to make any forecasts about the recovery, whether it will V-shaped or W-shaped or L-shaped, or whether it will be a year or whether it will be a decade. But I do think, and just following up my last answer, I do think that this by itself is going to make very little difference to the trajectory of climate change. The only thing that's going to make a big difference to the trajectory will be sharp reductions in emissions year after year after year, reduction after reduction after reduction. And that's going to require the two things we talked about earlier. It's require radical changes in technology, and it's required high carbon prices. And I think the lesson the lesson of these recessions is they hardly leave a trace. I could go back and show what happened in the financial crisis. There again, you can hardly see a trace of the financial crisis in the concentrations of CO2. So I think we're all. It's sometimes hard to think of anything else when your life is in danger and your family's life is in danger and your friends' lives are in danger and there's so much disruption of our lives. But if you want to think about climate change, you have to think about what we're going to do after the pandemic and even in the pandemic. And the pandemic itself is probably not going to leave much of a mark.
Grazie infinite. Ti faccio adesso una domanda da parte di Alberto Frisan che ti chiede dei climate clubs.
A question concerning climate clubs. At a time when changing policies seem to be key, do you think that the club you think of could give enough incentives to be accepted? Who should promote it and how?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'll answer it, and then if you can follow up if it wasn't what you were asking. I think we are in a situation where we do not have a club now, or compact. I think I prefer the climate compact to as a term. I mean, you might say Europe has a climate compact. It knows how this works. It has its ETS, so it knows. It has the administrative experience and the skill to set up a climate compact. But I think to make it work, you'll have to have probably 3 big regions. You'll have to have Europe, you'll have to have the United States, and you'll have to have China. Europe is already in a way on board. President Xi announced at the United Nations that they were not going to join a compact, but they had very, very ambitious climate targets that were announced. And the U.S., in the post-Trump era, whenever that occurs, I think will be ripe for this kind of idea. Outside the climate deniers and the energy industry and other people who of that persuasion, there's very widespread support in the United States for strong climate policies. There's pretty strong support for carbon pricing of different kinds. And I think more and more people are realizing that this requires an international solution. So I think what you need is basically these 3 country regions, EU, US, and China, to start. It'll be even better, of course, if the other major countries come along. But it does require a certain critical mass. I might add that there's a kind of cumulative effect here, though. It's a little bit like the EU. Once you get going, then people want to join it. So you need to set it up, and then once it's set up, and it seemed to be working, and the trade incentives are part of it, then I think it will have a kind of snowball effect.
Ho un'ultima domanda per te. Hai risposto, tra l'altro, alla domanda.
Thank you very much for brilliantly answering the question. You understood well. The Green New Deal in Europe. We have a discussion on the idea of carbon tariffs, not really like the ones you mentioned, but we have got started. So the idea of having a scheme of emission trading with a stringent cap, with the idea of carbon tariffs, that could be the first step in that direction that you suggested?
Yes, I mean, I think let me just back up. So for many years, there have been proposals for countervailing duties for countries that didn't participate in carbon pricing or emissions trading. And that was, it's been talked about for many, many years, or probably 20 years. It was talked about at the time of the Kyoto Protocol. It's also included in the Montreal Protocol on the chlorofluorocarbons, the provision for trade sanctions for non-participants. So it's not a foreign idea. It's well thought out. In the U.S., I should say, not everybody knows, but in the U.S. plan that was passed, that passed the House but not the Senate in 2009, that included the same kind of border tax adjustment. It was a little complicated and used a different mechanism, but that did include it. My view is that is a necessary part of any plan to get countries together. I'll just say why I prefer the uniform tariff to the standard approach, just because that's an important point. The first reason is that the countervailing duty is a very small incentive because it actually doesn't hit very many dollars and it doesn't hit them very hard. And I'll give you one example why it doesn't work very well. If a country is generating electricity with coal and consuming that electricity domestically, then there's no trade. So there will be no incentives. There will be no countervailing duty on that. So all the coal that let's say there were countervailing duty on the United States exports in terms of the coal, of the carbon content, it wouldn't hit the biggest industry for producing the CO2, which is coal-fired generation. So that's one thing. It actually doesn't have a very large impact. The other thing is that it's actually quite complicated to define. A uniform tariff that's simple. It's just everything that comes across the border. You have to define what it is, all goods, maybe some services, and bam, 3% tariff on that. For a countervailing duty, the people who've thought about this basically go to just find themselves tortured by the issues. I mean, it's easy to put a countervailing duty on things like coal or oil, but what do you do about the carbon that's embodied in products? Say, what do you do about steel? What do you do about automobiles? Automobiles have steel, but the steel has iron ore, and the iron ore might be produced by coal. So how many steps do you go back in the production process? Or if something is produced with electricity, then you have to figure out how much of the electricity is produced by carbon fuels and non-carbon fuels. Everything we use as electricity. So trying to disentangle the carbon content of our foreign trade is just a horribly difficult thing. So what happens usually is people just say, okay, just correct carbon content. But then that leaves out a lot of the carbon consumption of a country. But I do agree on the question. I do think it's a good place to start. I do think it has to be done in the spirit, not in the spirit of penalizing companies or countries, not in the spirit of penalizing countries, but in the spirit of a proposal to broaden the group. Say, look, we don't really want to do this. What we'd like to do is have a group with a compact where we agree to have common policies. And this is what we're going to do to provide incentives to people, not to just penalize bad people or bad countries, but as a way of trying to bring countries in.
Ok, ti ringrazio tantissimo. È stato veramente bello.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have you here and seeing you again. And I hope we could meet again here in Italy or elsewhere. Thank you very much and good night.
Siamo pochi ma siamo rumorosi. Buona serata.
Goodbye.